IoT Unplugged. Tune in to the Internet of Things. Managing the quality of IoT devices beyond their launch is becoming crucial for ensuring longevity and effectiveness. And as these devices begin to permeate every aspect of industry to public life, from smart homes to industrial IoT applications, the focus is now spread on maintaining their health through a number of key pillars, including connectivity, battery management, and stability. Effective IoT quality management not only enhances device functionality and data collection, but also safeguards user experience and the integrity of such data. But what should one look out for when implementing an IoT device quality management strategy? To discuss this further, I'm joined by François Baldassari, co-founder and CEO of Memfault. François, thank you for joining us today. Could you start by introducing yourself and sharing a bit about what Memfault does?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me today. Memfault helps embedded development teams find faults with their devices and their firmware and ship fixes to those faults fast. We do this with a SDK that gets integrated into the device and collects crash data and health metrics from every device in your fleets. And when there's a problem, pushes all of the diagnostics information needed to the cloud. I started Memfault in late 2018. My background is in embedded software myself, so I've worked on devices like the Oculus Quest virtual reality headsets, the Pebble Watch, and even earlier servers at Sun Microsystems. And I've always struggled with quality and the quality of the software that I built. I've spent countless nights cracking Pebble Watches open with a hammer and a chisel so that I could plug in my debugger and understand why that specific watch had stopped working. So it's a problem I'm very passionate about and I've been working on for almost 15 years now.
Okay, great. Well, to get into it, why don't we start with, so what are the primary indicators of a poor IoT device health that engineers should monitor?
This is a great question and one that is not as easy to answer as I'd like. I think when we started thinking about this, we realized that before we could start working on improving quality, we had to define what is quality. And so what we came to, and it's certainly an imperfect definition, but it is a good start, is we look at some of the key attributes of these IoT systems. We narrowed it down to battery life for devices that are battery powered, of course, but it's a lot of them. Connectivity, how well does the device connect to the clouds and through its different connectivity mechanisms? And product stability. How often does it crash or how often is it unavailable due to a software bug? And we think with those three metrics, we already have a pretty good view of the quality of an IoT device, although certainly for certain applications, there might be more types of metrics that you might care about.
Okay, well, so now we've discussed indications of poor IoT device. How can embedded engineers detect and address let's say, connectivity issues in deployed IoT devices?
So connectivity, I think, is one of the more straightforward one. And so first, of course, I've built a solution to these things, but taking a step back from that and thinking in terms of broad techniques, what might we do? The first step to measuring device connectivity is to have your devices phone in at a regular interval and record in a database somewhere when a device doesn't phone in, like misses an interval. And what you'll find is that for a wide variety of reasons, devices constantly fail to connect and fail to phone in. It might be because there's a problem with your backend. The device did send a message, you just didn't receive it. It might be that there's a problem with your connectivity provider, right? Many devices are cellular connected. And so, maybe the network is having an issue and you may or may not know about that. It might be a problem with the specific transports between your device and the device on the other side of the connection link, right? It might be a router, it might be a cell phone connected over Bluetooth, whatever that might be. And it could even just be it could be a problem with the device itself. It might have had a bug. The firmware of the device might not work. And last but not least, it might be normal. Maybe the user turned off the device, unplugged the device, or disconnected the device. And so, of course, measuring the success of connectivity is the first step. You need to start looking into the why, because it's such a wide range of options.
Okay, well, one of the big things also, so we talked about connectivity, but a big issue in IoT devices obviously is battery life. So maybe I was wondering, like, do you, what would you think is an effective strategy for managing battery life, monitoring battery life, especially in IoT fleets and deployments?
So battery life is something I care a lot about because of my work on the Pebble Watch. You may or may not remember the Pebble Watch, but it was one of the first smartwatches, and it used an STM32 microcontroller. It had an e-paper display, and it had a whole interactive UI. You could run apps on it. You could, of course, see the time, set timers, track your steps and all that. And battery life was a core part of the value proposition of the Pebble Watch. We advertised 5 days battery life. And to get 5 days of battery life with an always-on display and Bluetooth connectivity took a lot of effort. So I've spent, months and months of my work just micro-optimizing Bluetooth connection parameters, for example, to improve battery life. And what I found is that first, our intuition for what is and isn't consuming battery on our device is oftentimes wrong. So it is essential to have some system in place to measure it. At Pebble, what we did is we collected analytics, right? We sent the battery level of the device to the cloud regularly, alongside with what the device was doing, what apps were running, what sensors were active, and all that. So we could start correlating these things together and measuring true battery life in the field. By the way, it was worse than we expected because there were many users, especially at the edge of the bell curve, who used their watch a lot and impacted their battery life. There were also many bugs. Another thing that we did was we ran battery life tests in the lab on every commit, or nightly actually, I think in many cases, on our firmware. So every night we would load our firmware automatically on some boards that were connected to emulated batteries that we could control via software. And we'd run different workloads and measure how many coulombs were consumed, or how many watts of power were consumed, watt seconds of power were consumed by the device, the board, and see how it compared to the last snapshots and whether we had regressed in some ways or improved the power of the device. Ultimately, power and battery life is so essential to the experience of your customers with your device that I think there has to be a mix of these different strategies: in-lab testing, fleet-wide measurements, and most importantly, some ability to correlate by collecting the right sets of information the battery impact with actual behavior on device, so you can start improving things.
Okay, you talked a lot about sending data for analysis there. I was wondering if someone monitoring their IoT devices noticed there's a lot of frequent crashes. How should teams approach this? What should they look for, and what should the diagnostics look like?
Yeah, so because product stability matters a lot, and I think the main reason we encourage teams to measure product stability is to know whether they should do something at all. Because as you know, engineering teams are constantly pulled in two different directions. On the one hand is sustaining, right? Making sure that the existing products are meeting spec and are working as expected. And on the other hand, of course, is innovation. Spending time on building new products or prototyping new things so that we can continue building the future, right? And so by default, I think as engineers, we tend to want to spend more time on the innovation side. It's what's most exciting to us. but we need a measure. We need something to tell us whether it might be time to set that innovation work aside and focus on sustaining and on quality for a bit. And I think that's what measuring the stability of your product achieves. If you know, my product is stable 99.999% of the time, then you can safely focus on innovation. Your product's working great. But if it's only stable 98% of the time, that sounds like a high number, but it's actually, if you think about 98% of the minutes in an hour means that you have many minutes of unavailability within a week, for example. If your stability is only 98% or even worse, below 90%, then you really need to redirect your efforts and spend more time on product stability and on maintenance. And so first, it's about allocating our time in the right place. Beyond that, to your question about how do we actually collect the right data? Well, so if we have to spend time on maintenance rather than innovation, we need to do this as effectively and as quickly as possible. And there are two problems. Number one is the problems that are being reported are happening on the other side of the world, right? So your user might have done something you didn't expect and the device might have crashed. But because it happened on the other side of the world, you didn't have your debugger plugged in. So you don't know what happens. So that's problem number one. And so you need to spend a lot of time reproducing the problem before you can even start debugging it. And so I've certainly spent weeks of my life trying to reproduce an issue that several of my customers were reporting. And then once you've reproduced the issue, you have to collect the data that you need to fix it. You want to collect a stack trace. You might look at specific register values. You might look at the memory of the device. And so the ideal setup is one where when the problem happens in the fleet, these core pieces of information, you need to root cause the problem. The backtrace, a memory snapshot, register values, the logs of the device, and what firmware version the device is running, have all of that be automatically sent to the cloud, to some system of collection. And of course, this is one of the things we've built at Memfault, which allows our customers to start solving the problem with all the data they need without having to first reproduce it or collect the data themselves. So that's a little bit of the why, but also the how.
Okay, you mentioned a bit of the why and the how from a reactive side. I was wondering, maybe we could talk a bit about a proactive approach for maintaining IoT device stability post-launch. What would that look like? What would the outline of it be?
Right, so today most companies are very reactive. They don't really know that a problem is developing until their customers start calling. I think that in most cases, troubleshooting happens after an email or a phone call from a customer. It's very reactive, and there are several problems with that. The first is that customers do not always call. I read somewhere that, I wish I could remember the exact source, but I read that about only 7% of customers will actually call to report a problem. So that means that 93% of the time, you don't actually hear about it. But also the second problem is that when they do call you, you have an upset customer. And wouldn't it be nice if we could actually get ahead of the problem and solve the problem before we have an upset customer? And I think this requires a layered approach to quality. In development, it requires using unit testing and integration testing techniques to automatically test the software and exercise it more extensively than we would by doing manual testing only. It also requires doing beta tests and rolling out your product or your new software updates to a limited set of users so that you can check out some of the problems before you push it to a broader audience. And last but not least, I think it requires a more proactive approach requires some automated monitoring so that you may catch the problem and fix it before your customers actually notice something is wrong, before they get upset. And so to your customers, it might look like problems get resolved before they can even muster the energy to complain about them. And that's an amazing customer experience. on top of that, constantly, running your own test systems internally so that you can continuously catch issues that your customers might not even have triggered can add yet another layer of stability and make you more and more proactive.
Okay, excellent. Well, just earlier you mentioned firmware updates. Can you outline how they work in ongoing quality management of IoT devices?
What a fantastic question. I think when people think about quality, they rarely think of firmware updates being a component of a quality strategy. In fact, I hear many engineers who think firmware updates make quality worse rather than improve it. They see them as a risk. And so I want to make a few notes on that. Number one is, I think without firmware updates, there is no possibility of an iterative and ongoing quality strategy, because you need to update the firmware of the device in order to fix the bugs. And we know that there will be bugs. It is not possible, is it possible? It's very, very unlikely that you will ship a device that doesn't have problems, because you won't anticipate all the funny ways in which your customers will use your device. Even the most successful organization on Earth struggle with software quality on IoT devices. I think the Mars rover has had 16 or 17 firmware updates to fix bugs that it had. So even NASA, right, who has an amazing quality culture, struggles with embedded software quality. So if we take for granted there will be escapes, that some defects will make it into the field, then we need a way to patch those defects. And software updates is essential to that. And so this is why I find it really surprising when we, poll folks in the industry, or I just talk to engineers and find out that many of them still work on products without over-the-air updates capability. And some of them still do not believe that over-the-air update capability is a must-have. But I think these days it really is a must-have. You cannot fix a problem if you cannot push a patch. I'll also note that in the EU already, and in some ways in the US, there's increasing scrutiny on cybersecurity, which I see as a tangent or something near to quality. And cybersecurity regulation in both the EU and the US are starting to require over-the-air update capability, because you cannot fix a cybersecurity vulnerability, a security vulnerability, if you don't have an over-the-air update system. And so I think starting in 2026 or 2027, you won't be able to sell a connected device in the EU that doesn't have OTA capability. So OTA will become required, but I also believe that it is really a fundamental component of an ongoing quality process, because without OTA, you can't patch things. And if you can't patch things, you can't improve quality over time.
Okay, excellent. Well, so we've talked a bit generally about diagnosing, and you've mentioned a bit about how Memfault assists in that. But maybe could you tell us some mechanisms that Memfault implements to diagnosing and resolving device crashes remotely?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think all of these techniques are very important generally, and I encourage your listeners to start thinking about how they might use observability, collecting diagnostics and analytics to make their products better. At Memfault, we have built a solution to make that easy and turnkey, right? We have a SDK, it's on GitHub, you can take a look at it, that hooks into your firmware, whether it's running an RTOS or bare metal or Linux or Android, and automatically collects the right bits of diagnostics and also facilitates things like software updates. And that agent, one of the key things that it does is monitor the firmware for issues. So a common issue might be a crash, right? A fault being triggered. So we hook into your fault handlers, or we hook into kernel facilities on Linux to identify, a fault happening with a process, right? Like a core dump being collected. When those issues happen, our SDK will start collecting bits of memory, register values, logs, things that we know through our experience are the important data points, and serialize them on disk somewhere, right? Save them somewhere because the device is about to crash. We can't send them out. So we save them on disk, the device crashes, reboots, and then we start pushing that to the cloud or uploading it to the cloud. We do a lot of work to make that upload very simple, no matter how your device is connected. So it does, many of our customers are connected over Bluetooth. So we break the data up into packets and we reassemble it all in the cloud. On the cloud side, we do a lot of work to make that data easy to understand. So we ingest all of this diagnostics information. Then we reassemble it if it has been disassembled. We desymbolicate it, it's called. So we actually match addresses with function names and variable names in your codes to make it easier to read for a human. And then we deduplicate it. So we compare it to all the other events we've received from all of your devices and merge them together so that instead of having to read through 200 reports of the same issue, you can look at one report that summarizes the problem and tell you, by the way, 200 of your devices have seen this problem. This is super helpful and saves a ton of time. We then display everything in a very clear UI so that you can investigate the problem, leave comments for your colleagues, and hopefully resolve the issue. This is a complex system, but it works really, really well. And it's a very easy way to get started with these iterative, agile quality process for IoT devices without having to build all your infrastructure from scratch, like I had to do at Oculus, at Pebble, and my co-founders had to do in their careers as well.
Okay, you talk a lot about data being sent to the cloud. What are the challenges of ensuring the data security while monitoring device performance?
Security is of course a key concern when you build these diagnostics and monitoring systems. Every cloud vendor you interact adds a little bit of complexity to your security posture. So first, at Memfault, we get pen tested. So we hire outside security firms to audit our service and also try to look for vulnerabilities and compromise it to tell us how we can improve the security posture. We also get audited every year against a standard called SOC 2, which is a very US-centric kind of security and privacy framework that many companies use. But beyond that, we do things that I think every IoT company should do. Right? We encrypt the data in transit and at rest, so we don't send any data in plain text from the devices to the cloud. We've built a service that is only unidirectional. I think what becomes very dangerous is when you start having the ability to send commands down to a device. I know, for example, some companies that create systems to SSH or to remote control devices from the cloud. I think that's very risky. Memfault is unidirectional. We just push diagnostics information from the device to the cloud and analyze it. So a compromise at the very least doesn't risk the devices misbehaving. And last but not least, having a very strong security posture on the cloud side, having everything inside of what's called virtual private cloud instances, so that the actual databases and other cloud resources you're using to provide this service aren't accessible from the outside world at all. They're not on public networks. It's a layered strategy, but what I'll say is, cloud and SaaS security is a well understood field, and so thankfully there are many experts that we can go to help us secure our service. As opposed to IoT security, device security, which I think is still very poorly understood, and where there's still a lot of work to do.
Okay, right. Well, now moving on to managing or monitoring deployments with diverse IoT devices. What ways does Memfault, for instance, simplify the management of that?
Thank you for the question. Most device makers nowadays have a wide variety of devices they work with. You might be using different chips from different vendors, right? Maybe you have STM32s in one product and you might have NRF52s in a different product because you have different requirements. You also often have different operating systems, sometimes even within the same device. I worked on devices that had both Android and bare metal or Mac controllers running inside of the same device, for example. And so it's essential that cloud solutions for the IoT be multi-platform and very flexible in the type of devices that we work with. At Memfault, we've done a tremendous amount of work to make it possible to use our service with Android devices, Linux devices, microcontroller-based devices, whether they run on RTOS like Zephyr or FreeRTOS or just bare metal. We've worked a ton to make it possible for all of those devices to send data to our service and then show the data in a normalized way so that our customers can develop habits and get a benefit from a single user interface, regardless of what kind of device they're working on. We call that putting your entire fleet behind a single pane of glass. Whereas if many of the customers we talk to, many of the companies we talk to, they've built different siloed solutions for all of their different product lines and all their different operating systems they work with. And so when things start interacting together, it becomes very, very difficult to get all to inspect that behavior and to get to the diagnostics, because the systems are just too separate or too siloed, and they might even be used by different teams. So I'm very proud of the fact that we've created a very flexible solution that is multi-platform, and it's come at the cost of spending a lot of energy on our SDK. We have a large embedded software team that just builds our SDKs across all these platforms, and we're constantly adding support for new types of devices, new chips, new operating systems, new programming languages even. But the benefit of that, of course, is we can actually serve the most complex of customers.
Excellent. I was wanting to just quickly go on and ask, is it the same with your connectivity technologies as well? With those users using diverse connectivity technologies like cellular, Wi-Fi, so on?
Yeah, so for connectivity, we took a different approach. Instead of, for platform support, there was no choice but to create integrations for all of these different platforms. So we've created integrations into Linux, we've created integrations into Androids, and we've also created integrations into specific chip families, right? We have specific codes to work with an STM32. We have specific codes to work with a Scilab's kind of EFR32, for example. We've had to do all that work, and it's a mountain of work. For connectivity, we were lucky enough that there is commonality that we could use to create a single solution that works across connectivity mechanisms. And it's actually quite simple when you think about it. We've built a chunking mechanism that takes the data that we want to send to the cloud and breaks it up into packets. And the size of the packets can be configured by our customers so that if they have a transport that can send 100 bytes at a time, they can configure 100 byte packets. And if they have a transport that can send 100,000 bytes at a time, they can configure our system to create 100,000 byte packets. Those packets are self-describing, they're fully framed. And so all that needs to happen is those packets need to make it to the cloud somehow. So for example, for a Bluetooth device, you push the packets from the device to a mobile phone or a gateway. And all that gateway needs to do is read the packet and then post it to the clouds. It's a very, very simple kind of bridge bit of codes, maybe 10 lines of code that you have to write to bridge that to the cloud. And so with this simple packetization or chunking system, we can accommodate a wide range of connectivity mechanisms without having to create special handling for all of them. The key is that our packets the data that we send is very limited, so we make sure that we send as little data as possible so we don't overwhelm a data link, and can work with even satellite connections. Like our customers are So Far Ocean, use satellite connection. And we've built a domain-specific compressor that can compress diagnostics data to very small sizes with very, very little code. We have, of course, these chunking systems we've built, and we judiciously choose what data we collect so that so that we can accommodate very low bandwidth links like satellites, like Bluetooth Low Energy and others.
Okay, and I think maybe lastly would be what are the common pitfalls perhaps you've seen in your experience for those who are scaling IoT device deployments, and how could they be mitigated?
There's a wide range of answers to that question, I think, but I'll try to give a concise one. I think ultimately, as hardware makers, we have built a lot of expertise in making plastic and silicon and metal and the physical parts, the hardware part of our devices reliable. And it's taken a long time. And we take it for granted nowadays. Reliability, it's so ingrained in the culture of hardware makers that we forget that many of the things we do naturally were hard-fought practices and great discoveries at the time. If you think about cars in the 20s, they were certainly not nearly as reliable as cars today, and that's an amazing achievement. But we're experiencing this tremendous transformation where increasingly software is where a lot of the complexity lies in our devices. I was amazed to hear from some of the semiconductor companies, but also from some IoT companies, that nowadays they have more software engineers on staff than hardware engineers. And so software really is the core of what they're building. And that requires a completely different quality approach. And so it creates new problems. It creates, problems around cybersecurity. I think many people underestimate the cybersecurity threat faced by their devices. There's going to be cybersecurity problems with the third-party code they use from their chip vendor or from their operating system vendor. There's going to be cybersecurity problems in their device, in their communication stacks and all that. Like, that is going to happen. I think most devices today have a number of CVEs. That's the name for already identified cybersecurity threats that target them. And so we need to come up with a plan. We can't just close our eyes to this problem, because inevitably it leads to some really bad headlines that companies want to avoid. We have to think about, quality in the field, because software has the amazing property that it can be updated, so we can do something about it when there are quality problems. And last but not least, I think we struggle with the problem of interoperability. I think this is a common pitfall that many companies, again, don't think about enough ahead of time. Your device might work perfectly fine today, but the environment might change over time. A new Wi-Fi router might be introduced. The protocols might evolve, right? Apple might ship a new version of iOS that changes the behavior of the Bluetooth that on their side of the device. And so when the environment in which your devices exist can change from under you, you need a plan on how you're going to react to that and make sure your devices keep working as your customer expect them.
Okay, I think that's a good place to end it. Francois, thanks for taking the time to speak to us today.
The pleasure was mine. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I look forward to perhaps coming again in the future.
Yeah, we look forward to having you. Thank you. IoT Unplugged. Tune in to the Internet of Things.